Have you ever heard of the term red herring? You know, that classic storytelling trick where you're led to believe one thing is important, only to find out that it was never the real deal. Like when Harry Potter spent 7 books convincing us that Snape was the ultimate bad guy, only for him to turn out to be Dumbledore's most loyal emo goth friend. Or when WandaVision convinced us that Agatha's husband was secretly Mephisto. But nope, he turned out to be some dude named Ralph, with this guy actually being Mephisto all along. And guess what? The 1986 Transformers movie had its very own red herring too, only theirs wasn't red. It was red, white, and blue. Who just couldn't deal with that right now. After winning over the hearts and minds of kids everywhere in the 80s with 2 years of their ultra successful Transformers toy line, Hasbro figured that it was time to shake things up in a big way for year 3. Translation, they were running out of existing Japanese robots to recycle, and so new characters would have to be created specifically for the brand. And to ensure that the debut of their new dudes would make a deep impact on the kiddies, Hasbro didn't take any chances. Not only did they bankroll a full-length animated feature film to serve as the grand stage for their new roster, but they also wiped the table clean of many of the older characters that fans had grown attached to. It didn't matter if you were a scrappy little powerhouse or a dependable old warhorse or a thundercracking, skywarping, hell star screaming elite seeker. No one was safe from Hasbro's big reset button. Even the most merciless of tyrants and wisest of leaders weren't spared. And so as the story goes, Megatron, the ruthless gravel-voiced despot of the Decepticons, was brutally defeated and reforged into Galvatron, a louder, crazier, and arguably more unhinged upgrade thanks to the power of Unicron. And Optimus Prime, the noble, self-sacrificing father figure of the Autobots, got a funeral. Yup, he straight up died. And his death cleared the path for a new bearer of the Matrix of leadership, the supposed Chosen One, meant to guide the Autobots into their next chapter. That hero was Ultra Magnus. Or at least, that's what Hasbro wanted you to think. Unless you've been living under a rock since the 80s, you know what happens next. Ultra Magnus turns out to be, well, kind of a dud, a true red, white, and blue herring. Because the real Chosen One, the rightful bearer of the Matrix, wasn't Magnus at all. It was the young and fiery Hot Rod, who by the end of the movie had evolved into Rodimus Prime, just in time to light the Autobots' darkest hour and take down the planet-eating chaos bringer, Unicron. On paper, it was the perfect storybook ending. Exactly the kind of setup you'd expect to carry into the 3rd season of the cartoon. And yes, before anyone brings it up, I am aware of The Rebirth, the 3-parter that technically counts as a 4th season. But I mean, let's be honest, that was more of an extended toy commercial to introduce all the new throttle bots, headmasters, target masters, clones, double agents, and 6 changers. But I digress. The problem, despite his flamey appearance, Rodimus Prime didn't exactly, well, set the world on fire as Optimus Prime's successor. To be fair, I do believe the writers tried. I figured they didn't want a carbon copy of Optimus, so instead they gave us a leader who was inexperienced, self-doubting, and constantly weighed down by the pressures of living up to his predecessor's legacy. In theory, this was meant to be a growth arc, a chance for Rodimus to stumble, learn, and eventually rise to the occasion. In practice, he mostly came across as some mopey whiner, forever looking for an excuse to hand the Matrix back and bail out on the top job. And who was there the whole time picking up the slack? Ultra Magnus. Loyal, steady, dependable Magnus. Always at Rodimus' side, offering guidance, support, and the occasional pep talk whenever the young leader desperately needed it, which seemed to be quite often. So, it does make you wonder, did Hasbro really choose the right guy to carry the Matrix? Or was Ultra Magnus quietly the leader we should have gotten all along? I mean, think about it. From a toy perspective, Ultra Magnus actually made way more sense as Prime's successor. His original toy wasn't some random new mold. It started out as the Japanese-powered convoy from the Diaclone line, which at its core was basically the same Optimus Prime cab, only this time repackaged with a massive car carrier trailer that transformed into an armored power suit. In other words, Magnus was literally Prime Plus. So imagine if instead of killing Optimus outright and traumatizing a generation of kids in the theaters, the writers had just upgraded him into Ultra Magnus, Optimus Prime 2.0. I doubt any of us would have cried foul at having both faction leaders get shiny new upgrades, right? But instead, they went the way they did, and in the process ended up ruining not just one, but two characters. First, Hot Rod, who aside from his little oopsie moment that might have accidentally gotten Prime killed, was actually a likable, stylish, and well, cool character. Yet he was written off and forced to grow up into the aforementioned whiny Rodimus, who basically got no respect. And then, of course, there's Ultra Magnus, doomed to forever be remembered as the wrong choice. Basically, the guy who couldn't deal with that right now. The bot who failed to open the Matrix and got blown to bits in the movie by Scourge and the Sweeps for all his troubles. And as an added insult to injury, in the first draft of the movie, Magnus was actually meant to stay dead after being blown up, which just shows how little the writers originally thought of the guy. A total womp womp character arc if there ever was one. I mean, just think of the lost storytelling opportunities if they'd gone the other way. Traditionally, Ultra Magnus has always been portrayed as the serious, dour but loyal soldier, the guy who's perfectly comfortable following orders and never really aspiring for anything more. And yet, every so often, you catch glimpses of his natural leadership ability. So instead of leaning on the overused trope of a young, unsure leader being guided by a wise old veteran, imagine flipping the script. An older, battle-tested soldier with untapped potential, slowly learning to step out of his self-imposed reclusive shell with the help of a young, fresh upstart. Now that I could get behind. Anyway, while the ironically titled Rebirth story signaled the end of the US cartoon, this Magnus did have further adventures in Japan, where the cartoon lived on in the Headmasters series, returning to his usual role as city commander on Earth. And it is also where Ultra Magnus ultimately met his end at the hands of the Six Changer, Six Shot, who defeats him using his previously hidden 7th mode, Wing Wolf, to deal the killing blow. Well, at least the Autobots did give him a proper send-off, with a nice bed of flowers and interred inside a cave along the coastline of Japan, sealing his role as the Earth's fallen protector. Animation world aside, Ultra Magnus also did get a chance to shine a little more in the comics. Well, not in the US, that is, where he was basically featured in the comic adaptation of the '86 movie, and where he was notably dispatched in a more graphic way, literally ripped apart by the sweeps, which would explain why his body parts were scattered all over Junkion. Anyway, to get a proper version of Ultra Magnus, you would have to look across the proverbial pond to the UK, where in their comics, Ultra Magnus was introduced as a specially crafted Autobot warrior, designed by Cybertron's elders to inspire hope and strength in the darkest days of the war. His first major mission was supposed to be the ominously titled Operation Volcano, where he was assigned to back up the Wreckers in taking down a Decepticon group labeled as the 10 Deadliest Killers. You know, Kickback, Bombshell, Shrapnel, Dirge, Thrust, Ramjet, Blitzwing, Astrotrain, Octane, and some dude named Macabre. Hey, it was the 80s, there weren't that many characters to go around. And to be fair, that invented character, Macabre, ended up actually killing the Wreckers leader Impactor, so at least he lived up to the name. Sorry, I got sidetracked there. So, right before Operation Volcano is a go, Ultra Magnus is pulled away on an emergency mission sent to Earth to investigate the sudden extinguishing of the Matrix flame, which basically meant something bad happened to the Matrix bearer, Optimus Prime. Dun dun dun. Anyway, long story short, Prime is actually displaced in time due to the arrival of the time-traveling menace, Galvatron. And it's this personal rivalry with Galvatron that pretty much defines Ultra Magnus' story in the UK comics, showcasing what should have been the result of the Great Leadership reboot in the 1986 movie, in my opinion. That being said, I think some people would consider calling this a rivalry to be a little too generous to Ultra Magnus, as despite his maximum effort, in pretty much every encounter, Galvatron basically whooped Magnus' ass. But hey, at least he didn't die. And I believe that the powerful Magnus actually playing the role of the proverbial underdog who got knocked down but got up again and could do this all day made him more endearing to the fans. His unyielding willingness to go toe-to-toe battle with Galvatron over and over, even when it breaks him, makes him one of the most tragic but heroic figures in the Marvel UK era. But don't worry, kiddies. Years later, in the final issue of the IDW series Regeneration 1, which is meant to be the continuation of the Marvel story, Ultra Magnus finally defeats Galvatron. Ooh, check out that flying eyeball. Literally crushing the dude's head with his bare hands. So, good job, Magnus. Anyway, not counting that little leap into the future, Ultra Magnus' next significant comics appearance would be in the pages of Dreamwave. And granted, the Dreamwave universe didn't last very long due to the company abruptly closing shop and losing the Transformers license, and for the most part, their Magnus wasn't much of a departure character-wise from what we were already accustomed to. I do believe that Dreamwave deserves credit for being the first to depict Ultra Magnus just like his original toy, i.e. a white version of Optimus Prime encased in battle armor, strongly hinting at a brotherly connection between Prime and Magnus, or at the very least a shared origin, a popular speculation with fans that has taken a life of its own. So, back in the 86 movie, way back in the early planning stages, concept art was drawn up by Filipino artist Floro Derry for a character that would eventually become Ultra Magnus. Yeah, pretty wild, huh? Obviously, it was a design that was ultimately scrapped, but not for long, as it would then be reused for a character from the cartoon named Orion Pax. So, Orion Pax was a transformer from the golden age of Cybertron at the dawn of the Great War, and used to work on the docks. Union's been on strike, he's down on his luck, it's tough, so tough. Just kidding. So, he spent his days hanging with his girl Ariel and best bud Dion. Now, as luck would have it, the docks are attacked by the Decepticons, and Orion, Ariel, and Dion are grievously injured by Megatron. Orion is saved by a team of time-displaced aerial bots who bring him to a young Alpha Trion who rebuilds Pax into Optimus Prime. Later on, Ariel is also rescued and rebuilt into Elita 1. And while Dion, well, we never hear about Dion again, which leads to a popular fan theory that Dion didn't die, but was rebuilt into Ultra Magnus. And while the writers have gone on record saying that this isn't the case, we like to think otherwise. In fact, in another similar continuity told in the pages of Fun Publications' Wings universe, we are introduced to another old comrade of Prime named Magnum, who, along with Dion, is seriously injured in battle. Alpha Trion is only able to save one of them, rebuilding the lucky dude into Ultra Magnus. But it is never revealed exactly which of the two, Dion or Magnum, actually survives. And of course, adding to the fun is Dreamwave themselves, who placed their Ultra Magnus in charge of Security Team Dion on Cybertron. Anyway, while Dreamwave gets the credit of being the first to depict Ultra Magnus as an inner robot encased in armor, I would say that IDW gets props for taking this idea and turning it up to 11 with their own unique spin on that concept. And speaking of a unique spin, can you imagine how many unique spins I've tried to smoothly segue into my obligatory pitch to you guys to help me and my channel out? Yeah, this time around, I've got nothing, so let's just get straight to the point. If you're enjoying this story, please take the time to binge watch a few more episodes, or even just keep me blabbing about in the background as you go about your day, as extended watching time is apparently the true key to a channel's success. But you know, as always, a like, comment, share, or sub would also be very much welcomed. Either way, every little bit of help from you will always be very much appreciated, so thank you. So in IDW, Ultra Magnus is introduced as a legendary Autobot enforcer who upholds the Tyrest Accord, which is basically intergalactic Autobot law. He's your classic, square, by-the-book type of individual who is feared and respected across Cybertronian space because he's utterly uncompromising and incorruptible. But that's not what makes this version of Ultra Magnus different. See, by the time he makes his debut, Ultra Magnus is actually already long dead. Allow me to explain. In this continuity, Ultra Magnus is the original commander of the Autobot forces during Cybertron's early wars, fighting alongside Orion Pax before his rise as Optimus Prime. And at some point, he dies. And when he died, the main Autobot in charge at the time, the Chief Justice Tyrest, ensured his legend endured by creating the Magnus armor that is passed down to a succession of load bearers, or little Autobots, who became the supposedly immortal, duly appointed enforcer of the Tyrest Accord. And most Cybertronians never learned the truth, basically believing Ultra Magnus could not die. Sort of like the Dread Pirate Roberts from the Princess Bride movie, if you will. The most famous wearer of the armor was this little dude named Minimus Ambus, a principled but obsessive enforcer who held the post longer than any before him, and his commitment to law was so absolute that it often blinded him to compassion. And it's this version of Ultra Magnus that makes the rounds in the present-day IDW continuity. As Ultra Magnus, Minimus struggles with the crushing weight of the legend, hiding behind the armor while obsessively maintaining order, protocol, and records, which pretty much led to constant clashes with his fellow Autobots. Basically, he wasn't a very popular dude. That being said, his story arc in IDW is one where he evolves from an uptight, humorless enforcer into a more open and vulnerable character, and more often with the help of a younger, more upbeat and positive Rodimus, sort of bringing to life that potential storyline that I mentioned earlier that the third season of the cartoon should have done, which culminates in Minimus Ambus finally shedding the armor for good, rejecting the burden of living as a legend. In the end, you could say that Ultra Magnus, the mythical enforcer, dies, but as Minimus Ambus, a bot who had learned the value of connection, vulnerability, and choosing his own path, lives on. And it's Minimus's journey that reframed Magnus's story of an inflexible soldier defined by conflict to an individual who overcame the weight of expectation to find peace in himself. Now, I don't know what side of the fence you fall on this treatment of Ultra Magnus, but I myself like it because I think it really gives a fresh take on a character who, while well-meaning, usually comes off as gruff and one-dimensional, which is usually the case for most modern versions of Ultra Magnus, in my opinion. In the 2007 series Transformers Animated, Ultra Magnus is repositioned as the Supreme Commander of the Autobots and wielder of the mighty Magnus Hammer. And despite being portrayed as a rigid individual with an authoritarian leadership style, this Magnus was ultimately a wise and powerful figure, committed above all else to preserving Cybertronian peace. Unfortunately, though, his trust in the wrong subordinates ultimately leads to his downfall as he is nearly killed off by the Decepticon double agent Shockwave, who was posing as the Autobot Long Arm Prime. And while his ultimate fate is never revealed due to the show getting unexpectedly axed, the Allspark Almanac released after the show reveals he was intended to die in the unproduced fourth season. The next series in 2010, Transformers Prime, gave us more of the same with Ultra Magnus joining the Autobots in the third season and serving as Prime's second-in-command and leader of this continuity's version of the Wreckers. Magnus comes just in time, as despite his once again disciplined, rigid, and utterly devoted to protocol personality that oftentimes clashes with his fellow Autobots, Ultra Magnus proves vital in the battle against their returned prehistoric enemies, the Predacons. And finally, in the 2020 War for Cybertron Siege series, Ultra Magnus plays a crucial role in the opening conflict. As the keeper of the Alpha Trion protocols, a vast archive of knowledge stored within his brain module, Magnus carries the wisdom of one of Cybertron's greatest leaders. But weary of endless war and desperate for peace, he approaches Megatron to negotiate, appealing to their shared history. But Megatron rejects his plea and instead has him imprisoned. While captive, Magnus feigns betrayal in an attempt to mislead the Decepticons and buy the Autobots time. But once his ruse is discovered, he declares that he will never betray the Autobots and proceeds to get executed by Megatron with a point-blank blast from his fusion cannon for his defiance. His death, however, is not in vain, as seeing him murdered in cold blood is the last straw for the on-the-fence Decepticon Jetfire, who finally is convinced to defect to the Autobots, as well as triggers the release of the Alpha Trion protocols, which passes to Bumblebee, marking a turning point in the war. Now, while these modern iterations of Ultra Magnus often take visual departures from the original G1 version, at their core they tend to circle back to the same defining trait: unwavering loyalty to the Autobot cause. Whether portrayed as a rigid commander, a reluctant soldier, or a tragic figure, Magnus is always cast as the dependable backbone of the Autobots. for better or worse. That sense of sticking to the basics also pretty much describes his early toy history. For years, a good number of Ultra Magnus toys were mostly just basic white repaints of Optimus Prime molds, a callback to his original G1 toy, most notably starting off with the Classics version released in 2007. Classics Ultra Magnus was sold in a 2-pack with the Decepticon Skywarp. And while Classics Skywarp was very attractive to many collectors, for the most part the duo was largely ignored in the toy aisles. I mean, that classic Optimus Prime mold was really great on its own, but painting it white and calling it Ultra Magnus just wouldn't cut it for me. Then, out of nowhere, came a game changer from an obscure third-party company called Fans Project with their City Commander armor kit, which was basically the Magnus armor that white Optimus Prime was missing, giving you a true Classics Ultra Magnus. And all of a sudden, all those unwanted 2-packs went flying off the shelves and straight to eBay, where secondary market prices skyrocketed. For the longest time, I just had to settle for an evil black version of this set, which I still have to this day. It may seem rather outdated, but still holds some historical value as the single item that pretty much blew open the door on the whole third-party Transformers scene. Anyway, that being said, we got our first modern armored up Ultra Magnus toy in a rather unspectacular fashion, with the Titanium Series version also released that year. I myself never handled this guy, but the entire line was pretty much given a cold shoulder by the fandom for their clunky and awkward looking designs. And speaking of awkward designs, Ultra Mammoth, anyone? Yeah, I know this is supposed to be a different character, but he being a repaint of Big Convoy is an obvious homage to Magnus. Plus, I just love that name. But back to Magnus. After a few more white Prime repaints, we finally got our first decent, scratch that, awesome Ultra Magnus in 2015 as part of the Combiner Wars line, which thankfully wasn't a combiner. Instead, this was a pretty faithful plastic rendition of the IDW Magnus, which meant that he came with a cool little surprise inside. Nope, not a white Optimus Prime, but an even smaller Minimus Ambus. Definitely a cool toy based on a very unique take of Ultra Magnus. And speaking of unique takes, the aforementioned animated Prime and Siege Ultra Magnus also got their plastic representation as well. First up, Leader Class Animated Ultra Magnus, released in 2008, a time when Leader Class actually referred to the size of the toy. Like, this guy was big and carried a big hammer, and transformed into a very imposing 8-wheeled heavy expanded mobility tactical truck with deployable weapons. And was also re-released, repainted in Roadbuster orange and green deco. If that's your thing. Anyway, Transformers Prime's Ultra Magnus was a decently sized Voyager toy, which was okay. But after that awesome animated giant, this guy felt a little underwhelming, kind of too slim for Magnus for me. Still, it was cooler than the Deluxe Ultra Magnus that we also got, which was basically a repaint or retool of Fall of Cybertron Optimus Prime, so ho-hum. But onto more exciting things. Leader Class Siege Ultra Magnus was released in 2019, during a time where Leader Class referred more to parts count and detailing rather than size. So yeah, while this guy seemed to be more on the smaller side as far as Ultra Magnus toys go, it made up for that with not only his very intricate detailing and grimy deco, but for being the first modern Ultra Magnus toy since the original to feature an internal white Optimus Prime that could be encased in battle armor. Of course, given that the Siege series was set on Cybertron, this dude transformed into a pre-Earth mode, which in itself looked pretty cool. But for those looking for a more earthy version, Hasbro gave that to us in 2021 with Kingdom Ultra Magnus, an extremely retooled, cleaner version of the Siege toy, which was okay, I guess. I don't know. I found it to be a rather forced and awkward retool that I had no problem eventually replacing with the Studio Series 86 Commander Class Ultra Magnus, released in 2023. Now that's more I like it. Sure, he no longer had that inner white Prime feature, but that's completely fine. As for a trade-off, we got a much better looking, appropriately sized G1 Magnus based directly on his OG movie appearance. That may look a little wide when viewed straight on, but whatever. Best chug version of Ultra Magnus out there. Which leaves us with the masterpiece story of Ultra Magnus, which started off as you would expect, with a white redeco of MP01 Masterpiece Convoy released in 2005. We would have to wait all the way up to 2014 for a proper Masterpiece Ultra Magnus in MP22, who was also eventually released in the original Diaclone toy colors as a new character a couple years later, Delta Magnus, and who was given some Chug representation as well with a recolored Kingdom Ultra Magnus. Actually, that toy was released as Shattered Glass Ultra Magnus, basically an alternate dimension evil Ultra Magnus. But back to MP22, who is one hell of a chunky bot that despite being over a decade old and featuring an immensely huge butt flap, still holds up to this day in my opinion. I mean, he's currently my Masterpiece Magnus in my collection despite attempts from third-party companies to unseat him, with offerings ranging from the rather meh-looking KFC's Citizen stack to the very much improved but seemingly over-engineered Commander stack by X-Transbots, both of which get their names from the late actor Robert Stack of Unsolved Mysteries fame, but more importantly, who was the voice of Ultra Magnus in the '86 movie. Anyway, these two third-party Magnuses, or is that Magni, along with the official MP22, basically look the way they do, fairly decent masterpiece versions of Ultra Magnus, because they went the same route of doing away with the inner white prime and just focusing on giving us a sound, armored-up Ultra Magnus that transformed into his carrier transport, basically giving us a faux white cab that just folded up into his torso in robot mode. I mean, if there's one thing the OG toy all the way up to Kingdom Ultra Magnus proved, there is no way you could actually make a fully articulated and properly proportioned Ultra Magnus toy with an equally proportioned and articulated white prime inside, right? Well, along came the third-party company Fantastic Model, who said, "Hold my beer," as they gave us their masterpiece version of Ultra Magnus called Marg, which does have a white truck that does transform into a fully articulated white prime, and a trailer that breaks up into armor pieces to give us a very proportional armored up Magnus. What sort of transformational wizardry is this? Oh, one more thing. Now, this news will most likely be dated at the time you're watching this, but as I'm writing this video, this was teased. I wonder how long we'll have to wait before we get our hands on this missing link Ultra Magnus goodness. But enough of future talk, and back to Marg, who, crazy engineering aside, I guess proved naysayers wrong. I mean, jury is still out if transforming this guy will drive me nuts, as his rather hefty price tag has so far kept him from my collection. That being said though, I think that it's safe to say that my MP22 days are numbered. And speaking of numbers, do you know just how many videos I have on the OG Decepticon leader Megatron? Not one, not two, but 3 full episodes dedicated to the peaceful tyrant himself, all conveniently compiled into one long-form video that you can check out here. Or if you want to see my latest video, you can check it out over here. Either way, thanks for watching, and I hope to hear from you in the comments below. Go ahead and tell me your story.